Before the pyramids pierced the sky and before kings carved their names into stone, the Nile already pulsed with quiet intention. Each year, its waters rose and fell with a rhythm older than memory, transforming dry land into fertile black earth. To the untrained eye, this landscape might have seemed empty, an expanse of riverbanks, reeds, and desert winds. But beneath this apparent stillness, something profound was taking shape. Long before Egypt became Egypt, human communities were learning how to survive, adapt, and eventually dominate one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The story begins not with monuments but with movement, footsteps along the river's edge, hands shaping stone, and minds beginning to imagine permanence. Thousands of years before writing, before cities, even before pottery, small groups of hunter-gatherers followed the Nile's seasonal gifts. During wetter climatic phases, the surrounding Sahara was not yet a desert but a mosaic of grasslands, lakes, and wildlife. Humans roamed freely between these regions, hunting antelope, fishing, and gathering wild plants. As the climate slowly shifted and the Sahara began to dry, survival demanded a choice. The river became more than a resource, it became a lifeline. Communities that once wandered vast territories were drawn closer to its banks, year after year, generation after generation. This gradual concentration changed everything. People began to stay longer in the same places, observing the land with increasing precision. They noticed how the floodwaters deposited rich silt, how certain plants thrived after the retreat of the river, and how timing meant survival. What began as seasonal camps evolved into semi-permanent settlements. Stone tools grew more refined. Burials appeared, suggesting a new relationship with death, memory, and place. These were not yet kingdoms, but they were no longer just passing groups. They were communities with roots. As centuries passed, knowledge accumulated. The wild grains along the Nile were no longer merely gathered. They were encouraged, protected, and eventually cultivated. Early forms of agriculture emerged, not through sudden invention, but through patient observation and repetition. Domesticated animals followed, cattle, sheep, goats, reshaping diets, social structures, and labor. With food production came surplus, and with surplus came complexity. Not everyone needed to hunt or farm anymore. Some could specialize, creating tools, ornaments, and ritual objects. Society was quietly stratifying. Along the river, distinct cultural traditions began to form. In Upper Egypt, communities developed characteristic pottery styles, burial customs, and symbols that hinted at shared identities. Graves became more elaborate, often containing goods meant for a journey beyond death. This suggests a growing belief in an afterlife and, more importantly, a sense that individuals mattered beyond their biological existence. Power, too, was taking shape. Some burials stood apart, larger, richer, more carefully constructed, indicating leaders whose influence extended beyond their immediate families. The tension between cooperation and competition intensified as populations grew. Control of fertile land, water access, and trade routes along the Nile became crucial. Exchange networks expanded, carrying obsidian, shells, and precious stones across vast distances. These connections linked Nile communities to regions far beyond the river valley, embedding them in a wider prehistoric world. At the same time, differences between regions sharpened. Cultural identities solidified and with them rivalries. This slow-building pressure reached a turning point when leadership transformed into authority. What had once been respected elders or skilled organizers began to wield lasting power. Symbols of status grew more pronounced: maces, ceremonial palettes, and iconography depicting dominance and order. Violence, though not constant, left its mark in skeletal remains and fortified settlements. The idea of unifying people under a single rule was no longer abstract. It was becoming necessary. By the late prehistoric period, the Nile Valley was no longer a collection of isolated villages. It was a corridor of interaction, ambition, and emerging political vision. Upper and Lower Egypt developed distinct cultural and symbolic systems, each with its own centers of influence. The stage was set for something unprecedented: the consolidation of power on a scale never before seen in the region. What had begun as survival along a river was evolving into the foundation of one of history's most enduring civilizations. Yet this transformation was not inevitable. It was shaped by climate, geography, innovation, and human choice. Every stone tool, every cultivated field, every carefully placed burial contributed to a momentum that could no longer be reversed. The Nile had taught its people patience, timing, and respect for cycles, but it had also taught them control. And as these early societies stood on the threshold of unity and kingship, one question loomed silently over the river's dark waters. Who would command this world that humanity had so carefully built? As communities along the Nile grew denser and more interconnected, differences that once seemed subtle began to matter. The river unified the land, but it also created lines of division. Variations in flood patterns, terrain, and access to resources shaped regional identities with increasing clarity. In the south, the narrow valley of Upper Egypt fostered close-knit settlements strung tightly along the riverbanks. In the north, the broad marshes of the delta encouraged dispersion, trade, and contact with distant cultures. These contrasting landscapes did more than shape livelihoods, they shaped worldviews. Over time, local leaders emerged not merely as organizers, but as mediators between people, land, and belief. Authority was no longer based solely on age or skill. It became symbolic. Leaders claimed legitimacy through ritual, control of surplus, and their perceived ability to maintain harmony between the human world and unseen forces. Cemeteries reveal this shift with striking clarity. Some graves dominate the landscape, filled with finely crafted goods, imported materials, and symbols of command. These were not just respected individuals, they were figures of power. As leadership hardened into hierarchy, the need for visible order intensified. Communities began to express authority through imagery. Carved stone palettes and ceremonial objects depict scenes of domination, animals subdued, enemies restrained. These images were not records of daily life, they were statements. They told stories of control, protection, and cosmic balance. Violence, when shown, was purposeful, framed as a necessary act to impose order on chaos. Power was becoming ideological. Trade networks expanded dramatically during this period, binding the Nile Valley into a single economic artery. Gold from the south, copper from the Sinai, cedar from the Levant, and exotic stones from distant deserts flowed into emerging centers of influence. Control over these routes meant wealth, and wealth reinforced authority. Settlements that occupied strategic locations grew rapidly, drawing artisans, traders, and followers. What had once been villages evolved into proto-centers of administration. With growth came competition. Regional elites sought to extend their influence beyond local boundaries. Alliances formed, fractured, and reformed. The material record begins to show signs of conflict. Defensive structures, trauma on skeletal remains, and symbolic objects celebrating victory. Yet conquest alone was not enough. Lasting dominance required integration. Victorious leaders absorbed traditions, gods, and symbols from those they overcame, weaving them into broader systems of meaning. Unity was being imagined before it was achieved. In Upper Egypt, certain centers began to outpace the rest. Their cultural markers spread along the river, suggesting expanding influence rather than mere trade. Pottery styles, burial customs, and iconography became increasingly standardized over large areas. This standardization was not accidental. It reflected an emerging political vision, one that saw the Nile Valley not as fragmented territories, but as a continuum that could and should be governed as a whole. Religious thought evolved alongside political ambition. Deities became associated with regions, but also with universal principles: fertility, kingship, protection, and renewal. Leaders aligned themselves with these forces, presenting their authority as divinely sanctioned. The boundary between ruler and sacred intermediary blurred. To obey leadership was no longer just a social obligation, it was a cosmic one. By the end of this phase, the balance of power had shifted decisively. The number of independent centers diminished as stronger polities absorbed weaker ones. The idea of a single ruler over vast stretches of the Nile was no longer radical. It was approaching inevitability. Symbols of kingship, crowns, standards, and regalia began to appear with increasing consistency, even before a unified state formally existed. The land was changing not through sudden collapse, but through accumulation. Each alliance, each conquest, each shared symbol narrowed the distance between division and unity. As the Nile continued its timeless cycle, human ambition had begun to mirror it, expanding, receding, and returning stronger each time. The forces that would soon crystallize into the first Egyptian kingdoms were already in motion, waiting only for a moment, and a figure, capable of binding them together. The Nile Valley had reached a moment of imbalance. For generations, power had expanded in waves, alliances forming, territories absorbed, symbols shared. But equilibrium could not hold forever. As regional authorities grew stronger, coexistence became increasingly fragile. The river that once nurtured cooperation now served as a corridor for rivalry. Control of land, people, and belief systems was no longer a matter of prestige. it was a matter of survival. In this climate of rising tension, Upper and Lower Egypt stood as competing visions of order. Their differences were more than geographic. They were cultural, symbolic, and ideological. Upper Egypt emphasized centralized authority, tightly bound communities, and a visual language of dominance. Lower Egypt, shaped by the delta's openness, thrived on trade, plurality, and external contact. Neither system was inherently superior, but only one could ultimately prevail. The archaeological record captures this confrontation with striking intensity. Ceremonial objects from the late prehistoric period depict scenes of subjugation that feel deliberate and charged. Rulers are shown towering over defeated enemies, animals symbolizing chaos crushed beneath controlled force. These images are not chaotic depictions of violence, they are carefully composed narratives. They declare that disorder has been confronted and overcome. Power is no longer local. It is absolute. One object in particular stands apart for the clarity of its message. A carved stone palette presents a ruler wearing distinct crowns associated with different regions, overseeing scenes of domination and ritual. It does not name him, but it does not need to. The imagery speaks of a moment when victory became destiny. This was not just a triumph of arms. It was a statement that the land itself could be unified under a single will. Behind the symbolism lay real conflict. Evidence of trauma on human remains suggests periods of intensified violence. Fortified settlements point to fear as much as ambition. Yet conquest alone could not create permanence. What followed these clashes was just as critical as the battles themselves. Conquered regions were not erased, they were absorbed. Their gods were integrated, their symbols reinterpreted, their elites repositioned within a new hierarchy. This was not annihilation, it was transformation. As authority expanded, administration followed. Systems of control began to take shape. Standardized goods, shared iconography, and regulated ritual spaces. Communication along the Nile became more efficient, allowing commands, resources, and ideology to travel farther and faster than ever before. The land was being organized not only physically but conceptually. Egypt was becoming an idea before it became a state. At the center of this transformation stood the figure of the ruler, not merely as a war leader but as the embodiment of order itself. He was presented as the mediator between human society and the cosmic forces that governed the world. Floods, fertility, victory, and stability were all tied to his success. To challenge his authority was to risk chaos. Kingship was no longer a role. It was a necessity. This moment marks the true climax of the prehistoric world along the Nile. The long experiment of scattered communities, regional powers, and competing identities had reached its limit. A threshold had been crossed. The mechanisms of unity were now in place, forged through conflict, belief, and ambition. What remained was to solidify this power into something enduring, something that could outlast individual rulers and define generations. As the dust of confrontation settled, the land did not return to what it had been. It emerged changed, aligned under shared symbols and centralized control. The river flowed on, indifferent yet essential, carrying with it the consequences of human choice. The age of divided worlds was ending. In its place, a new order was rising, one that would soon give birth to the earliest Egyptian kingdoms and redefine history itself. Victory alone could not sustain what had been achieved. The land now demanded something more difficult than conquest: continuity. With the major regions aligned under centralized authority, the challenge shifted from expansion to preservation. Power needed roots, rituals, and systems capable of surviving beyond the life of a single ruler. What emerged during this phase was not merely governance, but the architecture of permanence. Administrative centers multiplied along the Nile, positioned to monitor agriculture, labor, and exchange. These were not yet cities in the later sense, but they functioned as hubs of coordination. Goods flowed inward as taxes and offerings, then outward as redistributed resources. This circulation reinforced loyalty while tying daily survival to the authority of the center. Control was no longer enforced only by force. It was embedded in routine. Symbolism played a decisive role in stabilizing this new order. Regalia, crowns, and standards were refined and codified, creating a shared visual language of kingship recognizable across the valley. The ruler was consistently depicted larger than others, calm amid chaos, enforcing balance rather than participating in disorder. These images taught people how to see power, and how to accept it. Authority became familiar, predictable, and therefore legitimate. Religious thought was reorganized to support this stability. Local deities were not erased, they were repositioned within a broader cosmic framework. The ruler stood at its center, not as a god among gods, but as their chosen intermediary. Through ritual, he ensured the continuation of Ma'at, the principle of balance, truth, and order that governed both nature and society. The annual flood, the fertility of the fields, and the safety of the land were all linked to his success. Kingship was fused with the rhythm of the universe. Burial practices reflect this profound shift. Elite tombs grew larger and more complex, designed not just to honor the dead, but to preserve status beyond death. Goods were carefully arranged, bodies oriented with intention, and ritual spaces marked for ongoing interaction between the living and the deceased. Memory became institutionalized. To rule was to be remembered, and to be remembered was to continue ruling. Writing had not yet fully emerged, but communication was becoming increasingly formalized. Symbols, seals, and standardized motifs carried meaning across distance and time. Administration relied on shared understanding rather than constant presence. This abstraction of power allowed authority to extend farther than any single individual could physically reach. The state was no longer tied to a person alone, it had become a system. Yet beneath this growing order lay a fragile truth. Unity was new and it required constant reinforcement. Rituals had to be performed, symbols displayed, resources redistributed. Any failure risked a return to fragmentation. The people may have accepted centralized rule, but they had not forgotten a time before it. Stability was an achievement, not a given. Still, something irreversible had occurred. The Nile Valley was no longer a collection of competing worlds. It was becoming a singular entity, bound by shared imagery, belief, and administration. Power had been translated into tradition. Authority had learned how to endure. As this system settled into place, a new horizon came into view. The structures of kingship were now strong enough to outlast the moment of their creation. What remained was to inscribe this order into history itself, to give it names, lineages, and monuments capable of defying time. The foundations had been laid. The age of the earliest kingdoms was no longer approaching. It had begun. Power, once stabilized, sought a voice. Symbols and rituals had carried authority across generations, but they were no longer enough. The emerging state required precision, names, counts, boundaries, and memory that could outlast oral tradition. It is here that the earliest traces of writing begin to surface, not as literature, but as necessity. Marks on clay, stone, and ivory recorded offerings, goods, and ownership. These were not stories yet, but they were the first steps toward history. Along the Nile, elite centers became increasingly formalized. Residences of authority grew more complex, surrounded by workshops, storage facilities, and ceremonial spaces. Artisans worked under centralized direction, producing objects that followed strict conventions. This standardization was deliberate. It communicated unity and control. Across vast distances, people encountered the same symbols, the same proportions, the same visual language of power. Egypt was learning how to recognize itself. Names began to matter. Rulers were no longer anonymous figures behind crowns and regalia. They were identified through symbols enclosed in formal frames, early precursors to royal titles. To name a ruler was to fix him in time, to distinguish one reign from another, to create sequence. Lineage emerged not just as bloodline, but as political strategy. Continuity was reinforced by the idea that authority flowed through generations, sanctioned by both tradition and the divine. Monumentality followed. Structures of mud, brick, and stone were raised not simply for function, but for presence. These early constructions dominated their surroundings, visible from afar, marking landscapes as claimed and ordered. They were statements carved into earth itself, declaring that power resided here, and would remain. The scale may have been modest compared to later eras, but the intention was unmistakable: to endure. Ritual intensified alongside administration. Ceremonies reaffirmed the ruler's role as the guarantor of balance, renewing his bond with the gods and the land. Festivals marked cycles of flood and harvest, tying political authority directly to natural order. Participation in these events reinforced belonging. To take part was to accept the system. The state was no longer distant, it was woven into daily life. Yet this growing clarity also exposed vulnerability. With writing and record came accountability. Resources could be measured, losses identified, and failures remembered. Authority became more visible, and more fragile. A ruler who failed to maintain balance risked more than rebellion. He risked cosmic disorder. Power was now bound to performance, not just symbolism. Despite this tension, the momentum was undeniable. The tools of governance, Administration, ritual, monument, and memory were now aligned. What had begun as prehistoric adaptation had transformed into an organized, self-aware state. The line between prehistory and history was thinning. As names were carved and symbols repeated, the past was being reshaped into narrative. Events could now be recalled, compared, and claimed. The world of the ancestors was no longer distant. It was being organized into a story that led directly to the present. And as this story took form, one final transformation awaited, one that would anchor kingship not only in life but in eternity itself. The final transformation did not arrive as a sudden break, but as a quiet certainty. By the time the earliest kingdoms fully emerged, the world that preceded them had already done its work. The rhythms of the Nile were understood. Authority had found form. Belief, administration, and memory were bound together in a system capable of sustaining itself. What remained was to project this order beyond the limits of a single lifetime. Kingship now reached toward eternity. The ruler was no longer defined only by his actions among the living, but by his destination after death. Tombs became more than places of burial, they were gateways. Carefully planned and ritually charged, they reflected a belief that rule did not end, it transformed. The afterlife was no longer an abstract hope, but a continuation of responsibility. To govern well in life was to secure balance forever. This belief reshaped the landscape itself. Sacred spaces multiplied, aligning the land with cosmic order. Orientation, proportion, and placement were chosen with intention, reflecting a universe governed by rules that could be understood and mirrored. Architecture became theology made visible. Even in its earliest forms, it declared that Egypt was not merely inhabited, it was designed. With this shift, the boundary between myth and history grew thin. The past was no longer a series of disconnected memories, it was a lineage. The earliest rulers became ancestors, their deeds absorbed into collective identity. What they had unified physically was now unified conceptually. Egypt understood itself as a single land, protected by tradition, sustained by order, and guided by kings who stood between humanity and the divine. The achievements of this era were not measured in stone alone. They lived in habits, expectations, and assumptions passed from generation to generation. The idea that the world could be stabilized through ritual, leadership, and harmony with nature became foundational. It shaped how Egyptians saw their place in the cosmos, and their responsibility within it. Looking back, the origins of this civilization appear almost fragile. Small communities choosing to stay near a river. Leaders learning to persuade before they commanded. Symbols forming before words. Yet from these quiet beginnings emerged a culture of astonishing durability. The first kingdoms did not erase what came before them, they fulfilled it. This is the true legacy of Egypt's prehistoric world. Not a forgotten prelude, but a deliberate construction of meaning, order, and continuity. Every monument that would later rise, every text that would be written, every god that would be named was rooted in these early choices. The past did not disappear, it became the foundation. As the Nile continued its eternal flow, so too did the principles forged along its banks. Balance over chaos. Memory over oblivion. Eternity over the fleeting moment. The age of the first kingdoms had begun, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, and setting in motion a civilization that would define itself not by how it began, but by how long it endured.